The US raised the bar in the Western Pacific and sent a clear message to China, Russia, and North Korea. A total of 4 USB-1B Lancers were deployed to Japan. 2 U.S. Navy aircraft carriers, the USS George Washington and the USS Nimitz, entered waters close to the Chinese coast with their strike groups. These steps go beyond the appearance of an exercise and create operational pressure that will directly affect the balance of power in the region. Moreover, official reports confirm this picture. International media outlets also confirmed that the B-1Bs were deployed to Misawa Air Base in Japan. The same media outlets reported separately on the deployment of the Washington and Nimitz near China. The timing and scale of this massive buildup of U.S. naval and air forces in the Pacific was not coincidental. This buildup established a pressure architecture that imposed both military and political costs on the China-Russia-North Korea triangle in one fell swoop. In fact, the value of this U.S. military buildup in the Pacific should be read on 2 levels. The first level is deterrence. When B-1Bs take off from Japan, they can strike land and sea targets from a safe distance with long-range, low-visibility munitions. Aircraft carriers, with their air wings and Tomahawk-loaded Aegis platforms in their escorts, exert deep pressure on both the coastline and maritime communication lines. The second layer of the massive military base-sized force buildup the U.S. has established in the Pacific is intelligence. When a force of this scale becomes visible, the opposing side's air defense and surveillance networks are forced to operate at a higher tempo. This creates opportunities for the U.S. and its allies to collect electronic signatures and map the rival's sensor-to-shooter chain. What is clear to everyone watching the region is this. This is not a statement of presence, but of readiness. The U.S. side has demonstrated its orientation in this way to China, Russia, and North Korea with B-1B bombers and aircraft carriers. The element that should be on the radar of the tripartite alliance is U.S. bombers. The geography of the B-1B's deployment in Japan provides clues about possible axes of operation. Misawa, in northern Japan, provides two-way access to the Sea of Japan and the Pacific. A B-1B taking off from here could fly a profile targeting the Russian Pacific Fleet and the Primorye coastline in the Sea of Japan on one mission, and on another mission, it could descend into the East China Sea and follow a route heading towards the facilities of the People's Liberation Army Navy Plan East Fleet. The combination of range and payload makes this aircraft not a first-wave platform, but a planned attrition weapon targeting systems from the second hour of the first night onwards. The Bomber Task Force profiles regularly conducted by the U.S. in the region are based precisely on these types of flexible test and strike patterns. The picture is even clearer on the U.S. aircraft carrier front. The USS George Washington, as the forward-deployed backbone of the 7th Fleet, quickly links up with Japan-centered patrols and drives air superiority and attack missions along a line stretching from the East China Sea to the South China Sea. The USS Nimitz, meanwhile, holds the second axis in the western Indo-Pacific, turning north from the Malacca Strait when necessary and completing the fleet from the Philippine Sea when required. The simultaneous presence of 2 CSGs in the region challenges China's area denial/anti-access A2AD plans. Because when so many air sorties, early warning, and electronic warfare platforms arrive in the immediate vicinity at the same time, coastal defenses must remain on constant high alert. This situation generates both technical fatigue and political pressure. This scenario is one of the clearest proofs that the U.S. is not just making a show in the Pacific, but is exerting continuous pressure. Now, let's look at the other corners of the triangle. It is impossible for China, Russia, and North Korea to remain comfortable in the face of this scenario. The first vulnerable area for China is the bases that are the heart of its submarine forces and the sensor communication networks surrounding them. The Yulin complex on Hainan Island, the facilities around Qingdao, and the Ningbo line are critical nodes in the maritime strategy and feature on every planner's list. Such points do not necessarily have to be bombed directly. When the radar, communications, fuel, and ammunition subsystems of these networks are targeted, the entire base effectively becomes inoperable. A campaign involving U.S. aircraft carriers and B-1Bs relies precisely on this kind of systemic disruption. For Russia, the risk is the bottleneck effect in the Sea of Japan. Coastal defense facilities, air bases, and port railway nodes around Vladivostok are natural targets for combined air-sea assaults. The goal here is not only to sink ships, but also to keep them tied to port. The same effect applies to critical air bases, such as Yelizovo in Kamchatka, and the railway endpoints of the Pacific Fleet supply chain. While this does not completely cut Russia off from the Ukrainian front, it forces it into a mode of minimal visibility in the Pacific and curbs its appetite for risk. On the North Korean front, Potential targets include the submarine construction and testing infrastructure in Sinpo, airbases around Suncheon and Wonsan, connections to the Yongbyon nuclear complex, and coastal radar missile batteries. The delicate point here is to control the escalation and maintain deterrence while securing fire superiority. Therefore, the priority for U.S. planners is the command and control, radar, and airbase runway fuel triad. When these are hit, North Korea's capacity to produce a large-scale response in a short time naturally decreases. The B-1B's munitions portfolio plays a critical role for these target clusters. The aircraft attacks deep targets from a safe distance with the low-visibility, standoff-class AGM-158 family, JASSM, and JASSM-er. The mission profile of the JASSM-er, as documented in U.S. test documents, is to destroy high-value and/or heavily air-defended targets from outside lethal range. Furthermore, the U.S. Air Force has stated that the B-1B has achieved early operational capability with the LRASM for maritime attack. These two pieces of information explain why China and North Korea's perception of a safe zone at sea and on the coast is eroding. Whether bomber aircraft strike fixed targets with up to 24 JASSM-ers or approach high-value maritime targets from closed water corridors with LRASM, in either case, the risk equation for the opposing side becomes more severe. The B-1B's profiles can be layered with the JDAM family and sensor-guided munitions to apply economic pressure on runways, fuel tanks, and radar communications towers. To open up the target sequence, the first wave uses JASSM-er to black out the brain of the air defense, namely the radar and command nodes. In the second wave, JDAMs disable runways and taxiways. In the third wave, precision strikes hit storage areas and fuel facilities. For maritime targets, LRASM provides the ability to pick off fleet elements one by one from long range. Such a package is not completed overnight, but when it lasts a week, the adversary's operational tempo is broken, and the cost of sustaining operations multiplies. The contribution of the USS George Washington and USS Nimitz aircraft carriers deployed by the U.S. to the Pacific is to make this pressure permanent. The air wing of ACSG, with its FA-18EFS, EA-18G electronic warfare aircraft, and E-2D early warning platforms, establishes air superiority on a local scale and also engages sea targets with its JSOW Harpoon LRASM portfolio. Tomahawks on escort cruisers and destroyers, meanwhile, produce hourly pressure on selected targets deep inland. The confirmed presence of both the Washington and the Nimitz in the field complicates planning for China. Managing two-way pressure with an A2-AD package tailored to lock down a single carrier is not the same thing. Therefore, China's early warning and air defense network must operate at a higher tempo on a shift basis, which increases the margin for error over time. On the other hand, the U.S. can strike, but the question of what the other side will do is also very important. China will likely increase its J-10C, J-16, and J-20 CAPS in the first phase, and attempt to shadow carrier groups with KJ-500 AEW and CNY-8, Y-9 maritime patrol aircraft. DF-21D, DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missile complexes on the coast become more visible as they prepare to fire. This also facilitates electronic intelligence gathering by the U.S. Russia, for its part, could intensify coastal defense batteries and MiG-31 interception flights around Vladivostok. The Kremlin could deploy 20,380 class corvettes and reconnaissance ships from the Pacific Fleet for shadowing. North Korea could attempt to exert political leverage by conducting ballistic missile tests. Pyongyang could keep coastal radars continuously operational and centralize air defense. The common weakness of these military responses that the tripartite alliance could give to the U.S. naval and Air Force buildup in the Pacific lies here. A high-alert regime brings fatigue and error to the system. What the U.S. is counting on is precisely to increase this fatigue and see the first 2 hours of a crisis more clearly. So what could these steps concretely translate into during a conflict? On the Chinese side, the high-value target categories are clear. That is, we are talking about the Eastern Theater Command nodes at the command and control level, the integrated air defense radar communication centers on the coast, and the air bases. At the force generation level, there are ammunition depots, fuel farms, and maintenance hangars. At sea, the telemetry, communications, and power distribution nodes of the submarine and surface ship infrastructure around Yulin, Ningbo, and Qingdao fall into this category. These targets cannot be eliminated overnight, but if their rhythms are disrupted for a week, combined with the carrier group's open sea patrols, the PLAN's daily tempo will decline, and the initiative for the next move will shift. On the Russian side, the possible target sets are more limited, but the impact is felt more quickly. The Vladivostok Port Complex and its associated rail fuel infrastructure, coastal defense radars, and anti-aircraft nodes, Yelizovo and surrounding airfield runway fuel lines and supply depots. Here, the U.S. goal is not to sink ships, but to make deployment costly and risky. Once this is achieved, Russia will reduce its visibility in the Pacific and feel more acutely compelled to divert its energy and time to the Ukrainian front. For North Korea, the first wave could again focus on the runway fuel radar triad. Instead of directly destroying Sinpo's infrastructure, putting pressure on energy and telemetry nodes that would slow down the production testing cycle carries a lower risk of escalation. Entering runway closure cycles at bases such as Suncheon and Wonsan reduces official aircraft production. Creating communication and logistical obstacles around Yongbyon shifts the decision-maker's agenda from military matters to internal security. In such a model, bomber aircraft and carrier air wings work together. B-1Bs blind the brain with standoff munitions, while the carrier air wing approaches and rapidly strikes runway fuel targets. How the U.S. side manages risk while all this is happening is also a sensitive issue. A possible first risk management plan for the Trump administration could be dispersed operations. Under this plan, carriers would never operate alone. And each CSG's layered air and missile defense would range from SM-6 to ESSM. EA-18Gs soften the radars. The U.S.'s second risk management plan may involve timing. Under this plan, JASSM, ER, and Tomahawk brain blackout sets are brought forward in the first 24-hour window. In the second 24 hours, runway and fuel pressure is increased. In the third 24 hours, when recovery attempts are detected, selected centers are shut down again. We can talk about visible deterrence within the third risk management. As long as 2 U.S. Navy carriers remain in the region at the same time, China's single-carrier lockdown tactic becomes obsolete. This increases Beijing's political decision-making costs. The other side's escalation options are also kept on the table. The risk of China firing signals with DF-21D and DF-26 could push the U.S. to spread its Aegis BMD layer more widely. Russia is likely to deploy electronic jamming and shadowing ships in the Sea of Japan. In response, ISR payload can be increased from the air and space. North Korea's short-range intensive missile strikes could challenge South Korea and Japan's Patriot, SM-3, SM-6 layers. The critical factor here is maintaining fire discipline and keeping the trajectory on military targets. In these scenarios, the U.S. advantage lies in the combination of range, precision, and tempo. B-1Bs can strike targets without approaching them, with a standoff range of thousands of kilometers. Carriers can produce cap-and-sed sorties hourly. Escorts can continue to disrupt the rhythm with Tomahawk strikes. Taking a step back and looking at the picture emerging in the Pacific from a much broader perspective, the following conclusion emerges. The arrival of 4 B-1Bs in Japan and the deployment of 2 carriers near China are not isolated moves, but a synchronized strategy. On the one hand, it keeps China's coastal defenses on constant high alert, accumulating fatigue and the risk of error. On the other hand, it narrows Russia's window of visibility in the Pacific and restricts North Korea's political blackmail capacity to technical limits. Official and open-source data supporting this framework is clear. The deployment of the B-1B has been confirmed, and the arrival of 2 carriers in nearby waters has been clearly reported. The munitions layer has been recorded for years in U.S. test and evaluation documents and USAF statements. Therefore, the real debate is not whether it exists, but how it will be used. The answer to the question of how long the U.S. will maintain this pressure depends on intent and resources. The intent is to maintain a free and open order in the Indo-Pacific by force and through alliances. Resources are not limited to 2 carriers and a bomber package. There is rotation and reinforcement capability. In this context, a possible crisis cycle could unfold as follows. Week 1, electronic intelligence gathering and jamming. Week 2, tempo pressure on air bases and logistical nodes. Week 3, selection of high-value targets at sea using LRASM and air-sea cooperation. The more China's economy's security dilemma intensifies, the more Beijing's appetite for risk diminishes. Russia feels the second front effect more acutely. North Korea's escalation thresholds become more apparent. There is another point to note within all these scenarios. Another game the U.S. achieves with this buildup is seeing, in high resolution, how its rivals' radar and command networks behave in the real world. This reduces planning time from hours to minutes in the next crisis or unexpected contingency. So every patrol flown today means an extra minute, an extra option in tomorrow's crisis. That is the essence of deterrence. Deterrence is not just the power to strike, but the knowledge to strike. Whatever your opponent's response may be, as this deterrent pressure model gains continuity, the risk grows on their side. This is the current reality in the region, and the official basis for this reality is clear. In other words, for the first time in a long time in the Pacific, the US has sent such a clear and strong military message to the China-Russia-North Korea axis. This is the main focus, rather than the concrete effects of bomber aircraft and aircraft carriers. The message is that if the US sees a risk, it will likely not hesitate to use its response capability. One of the most important issues is how this tripartite alliance will perceive the US message. We will be able to see this clearly over time. The only known fact at this point is that the Pacific is no longer under the control of the China-North Korea-Russia alliance as it once was. Thank you for watching.